So let's start our conversation about the formed elements of the blood. We just went through functions of the blood, we went through what was in plasma, and then what the formed elements were. And we know that the formed elements were erythrocytes or red blood cells, leukocytes or white blood cells, and platelets or thrombocytes. So if we look at erythrocytes first, so these are red blood cells. And red blood cells look kind of strange. From the side, they look kind of like this. And from top to bottom, they look kind of like a donut. Because guess what? They don't have a nucleus, okay? Red blood cells are made or born, so made in the bone marrow. And they come from hematopoietic stem cells. And these stem cells actually are the stem cells for all blood cells. And when they differentiate into the cell that's going to become red blood cells or erythrocytes, that's what they become. So when they go through their process of being made, they enter the blood system as something called reticulocytes. So reticulocytes are not mature blood cells. So they stay reticulocytes for about 2 to 3 days, like 48 hours, maybe a little bit more than that. And once mature, they mature into erythrocytes. They last about 120 days. So do red blood cells divide? Well, no, they don't divide. They don't have a nucleus. They can't divide. So they last about 120 days and then we get rid of them. So erythrocytes, their whole purpose, their whole function, let's put that here, is to carry oxygen to tissues. So they pick up oxygen from the lungs and then they carry them through the cardiovascular system, through the arteries, down to the arterioles, down into the capillaries, and they dump this oxygen off to tissues because tissues absolutely must have oxygen in order to be able to go through metabolism. So they do this, they don't just carry oxygen, they actually have these proteins that carry oxygen for them. So they contain these things called hemoglobin molecules. And each blood cell contains about 250 million hemoglobin. Molecules. And these molecules are little proteins, and they look like they're quaternary proteins, and they look a little bit like, so here would be one, And here's another one. There's two that are alike, and then better color. Okay. And then two over here that are alike. So these are the proteins. So they kind of hook together. So this is a quaternary protein, quaternary structure. And in the middle of these proteins is this little disc-looking thing called the heme molecule. And inside the heme molecule is something called iron. Iron. Okay? And iron loves oxygen. Loves it. So oxygen binds onto the iron part of that heme, and that's how oxygen is carried on these, or in these erythrocytes. So an erythrocyte contains about 250 million hemoglobin molecules. And each of those carries 4 oxygen molecules. So they carry 1 billion, one blood cell, one red blood cell can carry 1 billion oxygen molecules. Okay, and that's what they do. They pick up this oxygen from the lungs, and then they carry it to all of the tissues in the body. So we have something that we do, and that is, you may have gone to the doctor and they assessed your hematocrit. And the hematocrit is the percent of the blood that is actually red blood cells. That is the hematocrit. So we can kind of tell if somebody's, a little anemic, because if they don't have a whole lot of red blood cells, they're not going to have a whole lot of oxygen being carried, right? So anemia is the decrease in the number of red blood cells, or deficient hemoglobin. So, lots of things, or some different things, can cause anemia. Profuse bleeding causes anemia because you're losing it. Renal failure can cause an anemia. And let's look at that for a second. Why would renal failure cause anemia? Well, if you remember from the last chapter, the kidney actually makes the hormone that stimulates red blood cell production. So if you've got renal failure, you've got decreased erythropoietin, which again is a hormone secreted by the kidney that stimulates red blood cell production. All right, so red blood cells, they look kind of strange. You'll see pictures of them in your book. You want to look at those, and we'll talk about those in lab. But they are made in the bone marrow. They're not full cells. They kick out during their process of being made in the bone marrow. They kick out the nucleus because they don't really need it. All they do is transfer oxygen to tissues. So once they go into the blood system, they go in as reticulocytes, and then once they're mature, they are erythrocytes. Erythrocytes don't have organelles really. They don't have mitochondria or anything like that. They don't utilize any of that oxygen for their own use to get energy. All of that oxygen is held on to the hemoglobin and is transferred to tissues. All right, so the next video we're going to talk about leukocytes.